probably have about a dozen questions, and I'm not going to try to formulate any of them right now because I literally need to spend more time with what you've done. Again, it's extremely encouraging. I'm so glad to see this type of basically scientific data work applied to something that in the past was, well, do we have water or not? No, maybe we do, maybe we don't. Well, how much will it cost you? And that was it. You made your choice on something as simple as that type of a decision. So again, thank
Good afternoon, everyone. This is the November 17th, 2020 meeting of the City Finance Committee. And may I get a roll call, please?
Yes, Committee Member Gutierrez. She's absent today. Committee Member Harmon.
Here. Thanks.
Great. And Committee Chair Friedman.
Here, because we have a quorum. So before we get on to item 1, I will open it up at this time for public comment for items not on the agenda. Ms. Nicholson, is there anybody that you can see that is here for public comment for items not on the agenda?
Chair Friedman, I am monitoring public comment at this time, and I am not seeing any hands raised at this time.
Oh, so because you're handling the public comment, Mr. DiMartini, great. Sorry about the confusion there. So I will close public comment. And I will go on to item 1, which is the restatement of a loan to the Riviera Hotel item. So with that, Mr. DiMartini, if you will go from there.
Yes, I will actually be turning this over to, I believe it's Laura in Community Development Department that will take this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Committee Chair Friedman and Committee Member Harmon. I'm Laura Doubles, and I'm the Housing and Human Services Manager. I'd also like to introduce Lucy Graham. She is our Housing Project Planner. There she is. And she will be
Good afternoon.
Today. Thank you, Lucy. So we'll go ahead and start our presentation. Is somebody starting the presentation? Finance Director DiMartini, do you have the presentation?
Yes, Jen is working on getting the presentation up and running right now. Just be one moment. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, looks like we're here. So thank you again. Today we are here to talk about and request the Finance Committee's consideration and recommendation that the City Council look at a possible restatement of a loan on property located at 125 West Carrillo, which is Hotel de Riviera. Next slide, please. So Hotel de Riviera actually has a loan that was given back when the redevelopment agency was alive and well. And that we are here today as staff to recommend that the Finance Committee consider an approved restatement of the original RDA loan, and that would include forgiveness of the accrued interest. That would result in a new RDA rewritten loan agreement, and then also a new deed of trust. And we also will be recommending they approve a new extended covenant, a brand new one for 90 years that would be set to expire in 21/11. Next slide, please. A little bit about the property. The owner is Hotel Riviera Incorporated. That was done especially for the low-income housing tax credits that were done on the property. The manager is actually Santa Barbara Community Housing Corporation. They've been a local nonprofit organization, and since 1978, they have developed 692 units of low and moderate income housing throughout Santa Barbara County. The property is a 29 single room occupancy, which is also known as SROs, of affordable housing units, and those are for very low duly diagnosed tenants. Duly diagnosed meaning that they have a diagnosis of mental illness and substance abuse problems. Next slide, please. In 1988, our redevelopment agency, they did a loan for the Hotel de Riviera for rehabilitation of the property to change it into the current SRO type of property. And the original amount that was given was $468,500. It was written as a residual receipts payment loan, which is often done in affordable housing projects. And what that basically means is that after all revenue and expenses are taken into consideration, if the net cash flow allows a payment, then they would be making a payment to the agency. In this case, as you can see, the only thing that was received in payments over this amount of time was $7,908.12. The reason for that is there was not enough resources to keep the project in a positive cash flow enough to afford a payment back to the agency. And that is very common with these kind of projects because it does take an awful lot of operating expense to try to run this type of affordable housing project, especially with also providing the supportive services that are needed. So right now, our current balance is $1,136,969. That was actually as of November 10th. And as you can see the breakdown here, the original balance was the $468,500. There has been accrual of interest from back in 1988, May 17th of 1988, and that has accumulated at $668,469. So that is actually approximately the amount that we'd be asking for forgiveness on. It, of course, will be a little bit higher than that by the time that all is said and done, if approved, because daily interest is still accruing, and that was the amount as of November 10th. The original loan was written as a 4.5% simple interest, so that's the rate that that amount has accrued at. This loan was due in full back in May of 2018, but because there was no resources to pay the loan in full, staff started to work with the state HCD because they also do have a loan on this property as well. And the staff tried to figure out what we could do with this property so as to not to have to maybe take it back or to change it into something that was maybe not affordable housing or something that, you know, the community was not benefiting from. Next slide, please. So the current financing structure on this property is actually HCD, which is the Housing Community Development for State of California. They have rewritten their loan, and their amount right now that is now due to them and is being paid in amortized payments is $574,084. That was rewritten December of 2019 in definitely correspondence with our staff to try to figure out what would be the amounts that could be done in possible amortized payments to make this a better, more secure situation that could be repaid. So as of right now, the city of Santa Barbara, or I'm sorry, as of November 10th, our balance is shown on the screen, which leaves a total of about 1.7 million owing on this property. Next slide, please. So the state HCD, their restatement terms are shown on the screen here. They had a original loan that they had given for $300,000, and that was done at a 3% simple interest. They had an amount of $274,084 accrued on that interest. So they had put those two together and basically restructured their loan for $574,084 into a amortized 30-year term. And the monthly payment that's being made on that loan is $2,022.81. That loan is set to expire 2049 in 30 years. And as I said, these terms were worked out between HCD staff and city staff at the time to ensure that both of the agencies would be guaranteed a payment or repayment. And HCD did go ahead and record their documents back on December 19th, 2019. Next slide, please. So the city, the loan that we are proposing as restatement, in our restatement terms, we are asking for the Finance Committee and subsequently the City Council to consider forgiving the accrued interest because staff has reviewed financials and in a 10-year projection of financials and has come to realize that there's not sufficient cash flow in the property to be able to make a payment on the principal with all of the accrued interest. So we were thinking, okay, as long as we could possibly get our original capital that we put up and in a guaranteed payment that could be made and could be made for a period of 30 years, that we could take that amount of money that is coming in and use it as program income to reinvest in future projects. So we are proposing 3% simple interest, which is a little lower on the interest, but considering current interest rates that have dropped significantly, 3% simple interest is fair. And the monthly payment would actually be $1,975.21. It would be written for a 30-year term, and it would be set to expire in 2051. Next slide, please. Staff would be offering to do a whole new affordability covenant if the committee would consider this forgiveness of the interest and the new terms. And that affordability period would go for now a new 90-year term. And the original loan, it was written with a 30-year covenant term. So that actually has already expired back when the loan expired back in May of 2018. Since that was a 30-year covenant, we were able to at least ensure that the property was affordable at that point for 30 years. But now it has, our covenant has expired on that. And so in order to ensure the affordability continues, we are looking to do a new affordability covenant as a concession for basically possibly forgiving the interest. This new covenant would expire in 21/11. Next slide, please. So the benefits to the owner, this would really help secure this property to be more viable. It would ensure that there is a cash flow to make sure that there's a reserve and assistance for possible long-term maintenance items. It extends their loan term, so that basically will give them the ability to make lower payments than possibly what a residual receipt would have done, except for the fact that there was no cash flow, net cash flow that could have been made. But it does give that property a little bit more security as far as knowing there is a end to their term, it's amortized, and it's a payment that they're making every month in the same amount. It will lower the outstanding property debt. That actually ensures the project viability, as well as that actually secures our capital investment in this property as well. Predictable and reasonable payments with a debt payoff, like I said, and it provides assurance of a long-term quality affordable housing, meaning that it is a good project that is very much needed in the community. It helps the people that need it the most. The state's program that it's under is actually a special user housing rehab program. Special user meaning that we do have individuals that are previously homeless in here that also are duly diagnosed tenants. Next slide, please. So the city benefits out of this, the city will receive an amortized monthly payment. It will pay off in 30 years. And again, that gives us the opportunity to recycle this funding into other affordable housing projects. It ensures our long-term affordability covenant is placed on the property again, assuring that we have a long-term affordable housing at this property. And this also supports our city affordable housing program, as well as speaking to our housing element goals and priorities. We basically have put our goals and priorities on offering these types of housing projects. Next slide, please. So our recommendation, again, is that the Finance Committee consider and recommend to the City Council approval to do a restatement of the original RDA loan, and that would include forgiveness of that accrued interest. We would be rewriting the RDA loan agreement and a new deed of trust, and approving a new 90-year affordability covenant, which will be set to expire in 21/11. Next slide, please. And that ends my presentation. I'm here to take on any questions if you have any. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Doubles. So I'll open it up first to Councilmember Harmon. Do you have any questions for Ms. Doubles at this time?
Thank you, Chair Friedman. No questions for me.
I don't have any questions myself. So at this time, I will open it up for any public comment on this item. Is there any public comment, Mr. DiMartini?
Yes, Chair Freeman, I'm monitoring the public comment and I'm not seeing any hands raised at this time.
Okay. Great. That will close public comment. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Councilmember Harmon if you'd like to say anything regarding this project.
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Yes, just briefly, I want to express my appreciation for that thorough presentation. I really am grateful for the way that you explained the various benefits to the parties. That was really helpful for me. And I think this seems like a great solution to some challenges that folks were having, and the city really gets a lot out of it. I'm really grateful that you've negotiated, that staff has negotiated for the extension of the affordability covenant. This seems really like a very pragmatic and effective solution for everyone involved, including for us as a city, as we look toward needing ever more affordable housing here in our community. So I would be happy to make the motion to move this forward to council, if that's the right approach. Chair Friedman, I'll leave it to you to parse that for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Councilmember Harmon. That is move the staff recommendation, so I will second that. And thank you for your comments. I'll be brief as well. I'm excited that we're able to refinance this and get benefits for both the property and the city as well, and in particular the 90-year affordability covenant. I hadn't realized that it had already expired. So to have this this type of housing in particular, which is some of the most critical housing for some of our most vulnerable populations, to extend for 90 years, it will serve our whole entire city very well. So appreciate staff and Community Housing Corporation for coming together, coming up with this, and all your work, and just having this ability to keep these individuals in housing and having it for 90 years is a very big win for our city. So with that, I will ask for a roll call vote, please.
Okay, committee member Harmon
Yes.
and committee chair Friedman.
Yes.
Motion's passed.
Great, it passes unanimous. And so thank you for that item, and congratulations, and moving forward on that project. I look forward to seeing it pencil out. So now we are on to item 2, the first quarter financial review for fiscal year 2021. Go ahead, Mr. DiMartini.
Great, thank you very much, committee chair Friedman. I really appreciate it. My name is Keith DiMartini. I'm the finance director for the city, and it is my pleasure to present the Q1 financial review for the city. And as well, Jen spends just a few moments pulling up the presentation. I'll go ahead and get started. I will be presenting this afternoon with the city's accounting manager, Mark Sewell. And it's also worth mentioning that a number of department staff are also on the meeting today and available to help us answer any questions that the committee members may have as we move through. So the agenda for today's presentation will be just for me to provide a really brief overview of the process that dozens of department staff underwent in order to review most line items, both revenue and expenditure departmental line items in the current fiscal year budget, given that we now have three months worth of actual data. This was a much more robust, comprehensive, and extensive process than the city would typically conduct during the first quarter review, given the economic uncertainty. So staff felt it was appropriate to do so. I will then go into detail about departmental and general fund tax revenue sources and the trends that we are seeing. I'll turn it over to Mr. Sewell, who will present an overview of expenditures. I'll present an overview of the city's reserves for the general fund and implications going forward into the current fiscal year projection. Turn it back over to Mr. Sewell, who presents an overview of the enterprise department funds, as well as proposed departmental budget adjustments that staff is recommending, and then open it up to the committee members for any questions or comments that you may have. Next slide, please. So just to reiterate, the objective of the presentation this afternoon is for the committee members to receive a report from staff on the status of revenues and expenditures in relation to the current fiscal year adopted budget that shows 3 months of actual data ending through September 30th of 2020, including a number of budget adjustments that are being requested. Next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned earlier, staff typically present a quarterly financial projection to the committee and the city council. Because of the economic uncertainty that is still being felt, nationwide, but here also locally in the city of Santa Barbara and the surrounding region, Staff felt that it was appropriate to conduct a more thorough, comprehensive analysis and review of the actuals to date and what implications that may have on the full fiscal year budget. Again, both on the revenue side from our tax sources and also departmental revenues, as well as our expenditures. The committee and the council do receive a monthly financial statement of where we are each month. And then during our quarterly financial statement and projection process, we do provide a much more robust analysis. And this is the Q1 presentation for you this afternoon. The next presentation will be our mid-year report that will be presented in conjunction with the upcoming budget cycle as well. Next slide, please. So this slide just provides a very high-level overview, pie charts for both our revenues in the general fund only on the left side and the expenditures on the right side. So on the left side for the revenues, you'll see the breakdown of all of the revenue sources that flow into the city's general fund. And as you can see, it is rather dispersed. We have many revenue sources that come into the general fund. The most prominent sources of funds include sales tax, property tax, transient occupancy tax, and then a number of departmental fees and charges and licenses and other miscellaneous type of revenues. And what's important to note here is that a number of these revenue sources have directly been impacted due to COVID and the subsequent shelter-in-place orders, and just the ongoing impacts to the local economy and the businesses that operate in the city of Santa Barbara limits. Those in particular are sales tax and transient occupancy tax and departmental fees, which we will go into in quite some detail in the coming slides. On the right-hand side, you'll see where our general fund revenue sources are allocated and prioritized. More than half of general fund dollars go to pay for public safety services of police and fire. And then you can see the remaining general fund sources go to community services, public works, community development, and general government functions. Next slide, please. So this slide here shows a very high-level overview of the Q1 financial projection as presented in our agenda report to you this afternoon. The total general fund revenues in the adopted budget are about $159 million. And then you can see in the revised budget, it's approximately the same, about $159.6 million. And then the column next to that shows our full fiscal year projection, given where we are through Q1, showing a decline of just over $6 million being projected total for our general fund revenue sources at around $153 million. On the expenditure side, you'll see a similar trend actually, where we had budgeted about approximately $162 million of general fund expenditures. And then when you look over to the full fiscal year projection, we are projecting just over $6 million of additional expenditure savings, showing a projected deficit of just over $4.6 million by the end of the fiscal year. But when you look at the change of revenues and expenditures, the decline in revenues that is being projected is almost entirely offset by the additional expenditures that the departments are expected to realize as well by the end of the fiscal year. A couple noteworthy things here at the high level for some major takeaways are, just as a reminder, the adopted budget does include approximately $6.4 million of reduction targets that have been folded into departmental operating budgets. Department staff have spent a great deal of time identifying where we will be able to achieve these savings so that we can ensure a balanced budget by the end of the fiscal year. It's also important to note that the revised budget includes more of an accounting treatment where we carry over from a prior fiscal year any commitments that we may have contractually where we've encumbered an appropriation from a prior fiscal year and recognize that in the revised budget column. Again, this is more of an accounting treatment, and it's important to note that staff and departments will continue to be monitored and held accountable at the expenditure targets that are set for them in the adopted budget. Again, it's important to note that the year-end variance is very close to the revised budget. And at this time, there are no additional budget actions that are being recommended by this committee or the city council at this time in order to balance the budget. Again, this goes without saying, though, that staff will continue to very closely monitor the expenditures and revenues as they continue to come in, and will provide another very comprehensive review for your consideration during the mid-year report after the Q2 actuals have come in. Next slide, please. So now I just want to go into some additional detail in regards to our general fund revenues. Next slide, please. This slide shows where our current year, fiscal year 2021, actual revenues have come in so far compared to our budget, and then also compared to last year around this same time. So you can see on our taxes and our other revenues and our fees and charges total just over $28.2 million on the year-to-date actual column, 3 months of current actual data, compared to the annual budget of approximately $157.5 million. And then this compares to just over $31.7 million at the same time last fiscal year. So you can see this current fiscal year, we have realized just about $3.5 million less of revenue in Q1 compared to the same quarter of the prior fiscal year. If you can click to the next slide, Jen, just to show the next columns over here to the right. When you put all these numbers together and incorporate the projection information from departments, overall, we are projecting just over $6.4 million less of revenue compared to the budget. And you can see the major factor where this lower revenue is being realized in the fees and charges line, which I will go into in more detail in the coming slides. These are departmental revenues, primarily in community development, parks and recreation, and the police department that make up this biggest factor. The taxes line, however, is projected to come in pretty close to on budget. There are some differences among the different tax lines, which I will go to into some detail in the next slide. Onto the next slide, excuse me. Next slide, please, Jen. So this slide here summarizes our general fund tax revenue sources in detail, the major tax revenue sources in the general fund. So I wanted to walk through a couple of the significant changes that staff is projecting in the current fiscal year compared to our budget, and then also compared to last fiscal year as well. Starting at the top, as you can see, our sales and use tax revenue is a substantial revenue source for our general fund. The annual budget for the current fiscal year is approximately $22.1 million. And as you can see, current fiscal year to date, we've accumulated just over $5.5 million. And that is a little bit less than the run rate that we saw compared to last fiscal year at this time. Overall, our sales and use tax revenues is projected to be approximately $1.6 million less than compared to the budget. And this is primarily attributable to, again, ongoing impacts related to COVID, with many businesses taking advantage of sales tax deferral programs offered by the state of California, and also just the change of retail and sales activity within the city limits. That includes the reduced sales activity in many industrial sectors, going down pretty substantially, but partially offset by the increase in online retail activity that you might expect with the shelter-in-place orders. But overall, there is decline in sales tax activity currently. We have seen those numbers ratchet up just on a month-to-month basis, showing signs of some moderate economic recovery, but there's still a very long road to go to get back to our more normal levels. The cannabis excise tax, although it's not a very substantial revenue source for the general fund at this time, it has shown substantial growth month over month and quarter over quarter. So we will be continuing to monitor that revenue source very closely. Our property tax revenues have maintained very strong trends in the current fiscal year that's being projected so far compared to prior years. And this is different than what was experienced during the last economic downturns of the Great Recession, when we saw our property tax values decline fairly slowly, but also decline for a number of years post the recession. Those trends are not being realized at this time. Our property tax revenues are projected to be strong this year, and we will be continuing to monitor that closely to hopefully see that trend continue in the out years. The other notable tax revenue source is our transient occupancy tax, which, as the committee members are aware, was substantially reduced immediately following COVID in March and April and May of this current year. This tax revenue source has shown some gradual increase on a monthly basis after the shelter-in-place orders took effect, but they are far below our normal monthly run rates that we would typically expect in a given year. So staff will continue to monitor this revenue source very closely. Next slide, please. This slide here shows the summary of other significant general fund sources of revenues that are not tax specific. The notable general fund revenue sources I wanted to highlight for you on this slide are primarily our fines and forfeitures. These are primarily from the police department for parking and street related citation activities. Again, with many of those activities reduced substantially immediately following COVID. And those activities very slowly and gradually increasing over the number of months. That revenue source is continuing to show a projection lower than prior fiscal year revenues and also lower than the adopted budget as well. The intergovernmental line includes the CARES Act Relief Fund grants that we got from the federal government of just over $1 million. So that's why that revenue source is showing an increase from both prior fiscal years and also compared to the budget. On the fees and charges line is where staff is projecting the most significant decline compared to prior years and compared to the budget. And I'll go into detail in this on the next slide. If you can go, Jen, please. So this slide shows our fees and service charges that are being reported here at the department specific line, showing where we are coming in so far through Q1 and where staff is projecting these revenue sources will end up by the end of the fiscal year compared to the budget. As you can see, the most significant declines staff are projecting are in community development, parks and recreation, and the police department. For community development, the trend here is most significantly attributable to just reduced permit and other entitlement application volumes that are being projected, primarily for over-the-counter type permit services and other declines of more larger development project activity for that department. Staff are working very closely to review what projects are currently in the pipeline to help develop and make more accurate and complete projections for what type of development activity could be expected for the remainder part of the fiscal year, and then also in the upcoming fiscal years to come to inform our budget process. For parks and recreation, again, this is primarily attributable to many reduced recreation programs and other offerings that were immediately discontinued for the most part following COVID. There are many parks and recreation programs that have started up again, but again, very slowly and gradually. And so as those programs continue to be offered more broadly and come online at the beginning of the calendar year, that additional revenue has been projected in the department, but again, it's much lower than what you would typically see in a normal fiscal year. And then again, with police, this goes to more of the citation work or some of their over-the-counter services like live scanning services and other services. With the facility being closed more broadly to the public, they're seeing a decline in their revenues as well. So again, staff have done a thorough job of trying to review and analyze all of these activities. In a normal year may be very close to run rate, but because of where we are with many of the public facilities being shut down or have limited access to the public, many of these services are not occurring. Therefore, we are not able to recognize the revenue that we would typically see in a given year. Next slide, please. So just some general takeaways before we turn it over to talk about the expenditure side. Overall, our general fund taxing sources are coming in pretty much on budget where we projected. Again, Our property tax revenues are staying strong. So much are showing some growth compared to what we originally budgeted, but that's being offset by declines in sales tax and transient occupancy tax. For departmental revenues, they're coming in lower, as I said, compared to our budget, by again, the reduced permitting and development activities that are being seen in the city. And also many of our facilities continue to be closed or have limited accessibility to the public. So we're seeing much less recreation programming and associated revenues as well. And as I mentioned earlier, we have already experienced and will continue to see a decrease of fine and other fee-related activities, primarily in the police department. So that's the overview of where we are on revenues. I will now ask our accounting manager, Mark Sewell, to share his screen, and he will present an overview of the general fund expenditures.
Thank you, boss, and welcome to the city. Clearly a fast learner. He's only been here a few weeks, and I think that was an excellent presentation on the revenues. So my job here as the accounting manager is to assist Keith in working with the departments and obviously looking at our revenues and expenditures. And what I'm going to go over here is a couple of slides for the general fund expenditures. And then I'll hand back to Mr. DiMartini, who will kind of share with you what does this mean for the general fund reserves, and then I'll come back and do some enterprise fund Q1 analysis and projections. So next slide, please. So here we have a kind of standard table that you've seen before that breaks out the general fund expenditures into the operating departments. And like most years, the expenses are tracking pretty close to 25% for 1 quarter of the year. And so you can see against the budget of 163.9 million, year-to-date actual is 40.1 million. So it's just about 24% of the budget. And so therefore that leaves 120 million of the budget remaining. And I'll just remind you again, within that annual budget number is already $6.4 million of targeted operating expenditure cuts as a result of the anticipated reduction in revenues due to the COVID pandemic. Next slide, please. So again, we'll show you where we think through many hours of hard labor from our general fund department staff, where we think the expenditures are likely to end the year. And you've already seen, you know, in one of the earlier slides, kind of the bottom line here of the 6.07 million savings. The main story here is, again, as we would typically have in most normal years, salary and benefit savings do attribute and accrue a significant saving across a lot of these departments as we budget for a fully staffed operation. And of course, things change all the way throughout the year that aren't necessarily particularly known at the start of the year. And so we see that in a number of these variances to budget across most of the departments. The one I wanted to just point out was in the middle of the screen there over the right-hand side, where the fire department is actually projecting to spend more than its current budget. And you can see there's an $874,000 variance. Well, there's a recommended budget adjustment, which will be coming to you in a minute as well as part of this presentation. But that really is the impact of extra overtime that was over and above what was budgeted as a result of mutual aid calls. And so this will drive revenue, and we've already seen in previous slides an expectation of higher intergovernmental revenue. And so while it looks like it's an overspend in the fire department, it's actually fully funded and going to be fully reimbursable as a revenue source. So again, you know, with reduced activity in a number of these departments, there's the opportunity to save additional costs, but we know that in a lot of these areas, it's very, very difficult to save exactly the same amount of the revenue that is lost. And so, you know, to almost fully recover the anticipated reduction in general fund tax revenue and fees and charges with the department projections, I think is a pretty robust plan at this point in time. And again, we'll continue to monitor this as we go through the fiscal year. Next slide, please. Hand it back to Mr. DiMartini.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate that. So now I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about implications on the city's general fund reserves, given where we are currently projecting to end the fiscal year with reduced revenue and reduced expenditures, what implications that truly has on our reserves. Next slide, Jen, please. So just as a reminder of an overview of the policy targets that the City Council has set for our general fund reserves, our general fund reserve policy states that we are to retain 25% approximately of all of the next fiscal year's adopted budget held in reserve in the general fund. The reserves, just for a quick definition for the members of the public that may be listening, what that represents is the accumulated over time difference between revenues and expenditures that may occur on any given year that basically sits as reserves, not necessarily cash, but just reserves that are available for a beginning fund balance that can be used for the upcoming fiscal year. And those reserves are really important, particularly in a time like now where there is a great deal of economic uncertainty out there, where we as a city and many other cities across this nation are able to tap into those reserves in a strategic, thoughtful way to help minimize the operational impacts of city services to its public over time. Our reserve policy again states 25% of expenditures to be held in reserve. The policy target in the current fiscal year adopted budget is $34.6 million. That represents 25% of the adopted budget expenditures. In fiscal year 2019, it is a great accomplishment that the city was able to achieve the near full funding of its reserves at approximately $33.3 million. Not surprisingly, and what was adopted in the fiscal year 21 budget, but talking about fiscal year 20 right now, the year prior, the reserves were impacted almost immediately due to COVID. So the city made a decision to tap into those reserves, which brought the reserves down to $26.1 million by the end of fiscal year 20. And then given where we are now with three full months of actual data in fiscal year 21, and where staff are projecting to end the fiscal year by the end of the year in fiscal year 21, it's projected that the year-end reserves will continue to drop down a little bit more to around $22.8 million. Again, that's below the reserve target policy that's set by the City Council. Next slide, please, Jen. So this slide just shows in a more table format what I just presented on the prior slide. Again, in fiscal year 19, showing actual reserves of $33.2 million, which is only $1.5 million less than the policy target. Fiscal year 20, showing the required usage of some of those reserves in order to balance the budget by the end of fiscal year 20. It is important to note in fiscal year 20 that I think this is only approximately $500,000 more of the use of reserves than what was presented to the committee and the City Council immediately following the closing of the books during June 30th. So where we are actually ending up now that we're getting close to issuing the city's comprehensive annual financial report, or the CAFR, it's showing very close to what was presented just a few months ago. And then finally, where we're projecting to end the year, this current fiscal year, again, showing an additional use of approximately $3.1 million of reserves in order to balance the budget. Next slide, please. So what does that mean, going forward? And in order to kind of answer that question, it is valuable to look at historical trends of the city's prioritization and pattern of using reserves when we've needed to, and how we've been able to replenish those reserves over time as well. This graph here shows the general fund reserve balances going back to fiscal year 2005. The gray line is our policy target, which again represents 25% of annual operating expenditures. That is the target that should be achieved if we were to fully fund our reserves. And as you can see, starting in 2005, we were there. And then as we approached, and then the economic and financial recession that occurred in 2008, you can see that the city was able to and needed to tap into those reserves and able to assist in balancing the budget and minimize the impact on operations at that time. And then you can see it took a number of years, seven or so years, for the city to be able to begin replenishing those reserves to the acceptable target policy level, which was actually met in 2015 and 2016. And then you can see here the immediate effects of COVID are reflective in the fiscal year 20, in the 20 column, and also the fiscal year 2021 projection column on the far right side, similar to the pattern that was experienced immediately following the Great Recession. So staff will model impacts on the reserves in the coming months as we plan for and continue to develop our upcoming budget cycle. And the impacts on those reserves will be presented to the council as we work through our budget sessions with you at the beginning of the year. Next slide, please. And with that, I will turn it back over to Mr. Sewell, who presented an overview of our enterprise funds.
Thanks again. Maybe I can just ask the chair if you have any questions on the general fund, if you want to do them now, or if you'd like me to continue and through the presentation.
Let's go ahead and ask questions now.
Okay.
On these funds. So did you have any questions, Councilmember Harmon?
Thank you, Chair Friedman. None from me at this time.
I just had a couple of questions going back to the previous. So for cannabis, being that we had 2 that were fully operational and now we have a 3rd that's online, were we projecting to have that 3rd as part of our initial budget, or is that something in addition that we were looking at coming online?
Yeah, through the chair, I believe that we were projecting additional revenue from that establishment coming online, but I believe that the amount of tax revenues that are coming pretty much broadly from the cannabis activities happening in the city are outpacing what we originally thought in the budget. So the amount of revenue from all of the cannabis activity is coming in much stronger than was originally anticipated.
Great. And I think that was the only question I had. I think everything else is self-explanatory. So continue on with the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, I will. So yes, the enterprise funds, I'm going to go over a number of them in the next few slides. And just for those who might be watching who haven't seen one of these before, enterprise funds are different from the general fund in that they are more business-like and their operations are to be funded from revenues that they generate through providing services or products. And so slightly different in terms of how we review them and look at them. So I've got 4 of them on this slide, and then there's another slide coming up with another 3 on there. I don't intend to go through each one individually. Included in the council agenda report and packet is some commentary about each one, just conscious of time. Next slide, please. What I wanted to point out was the downtown parking fund. Now, all but one of the enterprise funds at the city have been severely negatively impacted by COVID. Downtown parking is actually standing out as probably one of those which is most negatively affected. And it makes sense when you think about, well, what does it really do, right? It's there providing parking for people who work and want to come and visit downtown Santa Barbara. And of course, with stay-at-home orders and other health restrictions, that demand for that service has fallen very, very sharply. And so revenue projections have obviously followed suit. And so even at Q1 though, only 16% of the annual budget has been received, where typically 26% would have been received. Next slide, please. What I wanted to then show you, and when we start sliding across the full year projection, is that the staff in the downtown parking fund are projecting almost $3 million reduction in revenue versus budget. And I know that council will be considering an action later on today, which is looking to try to find some ways to address some of these fiscal challenges. However, as we sit here right now, none of that's baked into this projection, and so this fund is projected to consume just over $3.5 million of reserves. And I'll share with the council that they ended last fiscal year with about $3.5 million in reserves. So, you know, with no changes, this fund is going to be bouncing around in a kind of a zero available reserve level. And of course, there will be, you know, recommendations, and staff are continuing to look at ways to try to help this fund progress. Next slide, please. So I'll just sort of show you the rest of them in the sense of this, in terms of where we are projecting things. Solid waste fund, I'm kind of look at it from a standpoint of the blue shaded lines in terms of what do we think the difference between the revenues that are projected and the expenses that are projected. So you can see solid waste looks like it's going to be there or thereabouts in terms of a balanced budget this fiscal year, albeit with lower revenues and lower expenditures due to the nature of how the majority of those revenues are a pass through to Marburg, who provides the bulk of the services. If you look at the water fund, again, for a nearly $60 million fund, to miss by about 755,000 isn't a massive variance. But again, it's kind of shows that revenues are projected to be 10 million lower than budget. That's actually a little misleading if you were thinking about that might be, is that for fees for water use? That's actually a grant that was budgeted to be received that staff are now considering won't be requested. So that doesn't really it shouldn't give the impression that water sales are expected to be significantly lower. And then of course they've found some expenditure savings there of $5 million. The wastewater fund actually looks to be projecting to be producing in excess of revenues over expenses at the end of this fiscal year. And then as I mentioned earlier, the downtown parking fund, where we're seeing a projection to need to use $3.6 million of reserves. Next slide, please. So here's then the remainder of the major funds. Next slide, please. I want to just jump straight to the projections. Airport fund is projected to use reserves this year, again, of $1.5 million. It's worth noting, obviously the airport has been significantly impacted by the COVID pandemic. Transport and tourism clearly is a lot harder in a lockdown environment. But however, it was successful in fiscal year 20 of receiving requesting and receiving a grant from the Federal Aviation Authority as part of the CARES Act for a total of $9.5 million. $4.5 million of that was received into fiscal year 20. And so this projection here for $22.6 million of revenue includes the remaining $5 million. So without that additional funding, of course, then the position would have looked a lot worse at the airport. And of course, we hope that the conditions are going to improve for the airport fund, and transport and travel will hope to rebound in the new year. But of course, I think everyone's kind of taken a prudent and conservative approach to how quickly they think that's going to occur. Next slide, please. And there you go. I was a little bit out of sync. Next one, please. Here we go. So waterfront, similar. However, it didn't receive any federal funding, so therefore you're seeing a use of reserves forecast of $2.7 million, and that's primarily to do with the revenues that are being projected, where of course there's lower volume visiting the wharf, visiting the harbour, visiting the restaurants. A lot of the tenants, I think probably about between a quarter and a third of the tenants have applied for deferral of rent. And so while these numbers include the assumption that that rent will be paid, of course, it does bring us into an element of risk that isn't absolutely guaranteed. So I know that waterfront staff are working closely with each of their concessionaires and trying to find ways to work with them, because of course everyone's affected and impacted by this. But as it stands, if those projections hold true, then the waterfront fund will be using just over $2.5 million of reserves. And then next slide. And this really is the outlier, the golf fund. It's very, very interesting that the golf courses, of course, were closed for about 4 or 5 weeks as an initial response to the pandemic, and then were considered to be something that could be reopened with some, adjustments and be relatively safe. And it's exploded. Demand for golf has absolutely exploded, and it's continued through the summer. And so the Parks and Recreation Department are projecting for that trend to continue, seeing no signs of it slowing down. And the golf fund is actually being projected to beat its revenue targets by $350,000. It will have some additional costs, associated with that, but looking to put back $360,000 into its reserves. And if that again comes true, then for the first time in probably 15 years, the golf fund may actually meet its council set reserve policy goals. So it's kind of the silver lining in a very, very, very large cloud. But I wanted to share that with you. Next slide, please. So that's the end of the charts for the enterprise funds. Again, I'll pause if there's any questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to carry forward into some of the budget adjustments.
No questions for me, Councilmember Harmon. Do you have any questions?
No, thank you, Chair Friedman.
Thank you. I continue on, Mr. Silva.
Great, thank you. So as Mr. DiMartini mentioned right at the start of this presentation, we provide a monthly interim report to Council, and then once a quarter we bring a more in-depth analysis, and that's an opportunity for departments to share information with us as the Finance Department. We can then bring it forward to the Finance Committee and Council for any changes that were unplanned or any adjustments that are necessary to ensure that they're continuing to provide their services and their operations. So included in the Council Agenda Report as Attachment 3 are a number of budget adjustments. I think there's over 30 of them. I'm not proposing to go through each one of them here in terms of the presentation, but what we do like to do is make sure, of course, that we go over some of the larger general fund items and take any questions that are appropriate for you to be comfortable to make a recommendation. Next slide, please. So there we go. In the general fund, I've got about 5 or 6 that I want to just go through very quickly and take any questions again if you want any more detail. So the first item here, A, this is something which we mentioned last year at the end of the year, whereby under the recommendation from our new auditors, and we agreed with it, we closed a fund, an agency fund, that for a pension that had existed for many, many years for a number of staff who retired and left the city 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, prior to the city joining CalPERS. And so the city was required to make payments to these individuals and their beneficiaries, and has continued to do so. Following the recommendation from the auditors, we closed that fund. It didn't really have any of its own assets, and recognized that this is an ongoing obligation of the general fund. And due to that, we were actually overfunding it in our budget assumptions to try to kind of catch up. That wasn't necessary after we transferred it all back to the general fund. And so this is just restating the amount of financing that we need to actually then pay those beneficiaries in fiscal year 2021, and it results in a reduction of $86,000. So that's a good thing. That's going to go back into the reserve for the general fund in fiscal year 21. The next one, we've seen this regularly over the last couple of years, in that the fire department uses a dedicated hourly IT resource that's actually programmed and managed by our IT department, and that's a separate fund. It's an internal service fund. And so this adjustment just allows us to then actually have the fire department reimburse the IT department for that labor. And that's the $26,000 that you see there. The third item, item C, both Mr. DiMartini and I mentioned this in our analysis of general fund revenues and expenditures. This is the $1 million that the fire department is at this point in time recommending we appropriate, on the basis that we are expecting to receive at least that as revenue, in addition to what's already budgeted. And as you're aware, there's been a significant amount of fires throughout California that Santa Barbara Fire Department has helped and responded to as part of that agreement. So this just recognizes that extra overtime that we've paid, and then the reimbursement expectation going forward. Next slide, please. This is the last slide of budget adjustments, so you'll be pleased to know. So item D, this is an adjustment the Community Development Department are asking for, to appropriate $35,000 from general fund reserves for CityNet activities in support of housing and health services for the homeless population. E, this is an adjustment to part of the Public Works targeted expenditure reduction plan, and they're looking to actually appropriate additional revenues that we're anticipating and then offset some of that target plan. And so because they're requesting additional appropriations, we need to bring that to council and make sure that council approves the additional appropriation. And then finally, we've got an adjustment here from the Community Development Department and Parks and Recreation Department. Again, similarly in terms of recognizing adjustments to allocate department savings. And this is in recognition, if you remember, when we were looking to recalibrate and adjust our budgets following the impact of COVID, there just wasn't enough time to enter all the specific line-by-line details in the areas that they needed to be. And so we loaded some significant adjustments as one-liners in the department's budget areas. And so these adjustments just help us to move them into the appropriate place going forward so they can be monitored and tracked appropriately. And so that's the end believe, of the budget adjustment section. Next slide, please. And so there we go. So following all of that, we are asking for a recommendation today, please. Recommendation to Council that you accept the 21 interim financial statements for 3 months ended September 30th and approve the proposed first quarter adjustments to fiscal year 2021 appropriations and estimated revenues as detailed in the attached schedule of proposed first quarter adjustments. Next slide, please. There we go. Questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Sewell. Appreciate the very thorough presentation from you and Mr. DiMartini. Before we open up to public comment, are there any questions from Councilmember Harmon at this point in general on any items?
No, thanks.
I do have one question. I know it's a little early, but I know it's going to be on people's mind. Is in light of the governor pushing us back into the purple tier, I know that's a setback for a lot of our businesses. What kind of measures are we looking, or what are we doing to measure over the coming weeks, or however long it is, the impacts to the regression in terms of our larger taxes, such as our transit occupancy tax, our sales tax, or even the fees from programs? How are we trying to account for the coming weeks back in the purple tier?
Yeah, thank you for your question, Chair Friedman. That's with the information and the direction just coming out from the governor's office this week. It will take staff a little bit of time to fully understand the implications to how city business will operate, our facilities, if there are any changes that may be required. So that will be incorporated and analyzed in the coming weeks. As far as the impacts to our local economy with businesses, we know that there are impacts immediately for restaurants and for restrictions for the percent how many people can be in an indoor facility like gymnasiums and other buildings. And so it is very likely that we would probably experience some additional reduced either sales tax or eventually some business license tax revenue because of that additional change. The implications and the magnitude of that, though, is unknown because businesses have been able to respond in light of COVID to operate in a different way, such as restaurants operating outdoors. I know it's not their full capacity, for example, but sort of the magnitude of the initial response to our local businesses due to this change is a little bit unknown at this time, but we will monitor that in the coming months to evaluate and understand the implications on our budget.
Thank you. I just wanted to, for the public, and just a general overview that we are cognizant of what took place within the last 24 hours and that we are looking, have systems in place to monitor that. So, and I suspect that when we get to the mid-year report in January, we'll have a little bit of data and have more where we are in terms of our budget year to date, and that will have some of this time taken into consideration. So those are the only questions I have at this point. So now I'll open it up to any public comments on this item. And are there any members of the public who wish to speak?
Mr. Chair Friedman, I am monitoring members of the public, and I'm not seeing any hands raised at this time.
Okay, great. Well, I will close public comment at this point. And so now I turn it over to us. So we have a staff recommendation for the adjustments. And so Councilmember Harmon, do you have a motion or comments at this point?
Thank you, Chair Friedman. Just appreciate the very thorough presentation. That's a lot to digest, but very helpful information. And I would be happy to move the staff recommendation.
I will second it. And may I get a roll call, please?
Yes. Councilmember Harmon.
Yes.
And Committee Chair Friedman.
Yes.
Okay, the motion passes unanimously.
Passed unanimously. Thank you. And with that, unless there is anything else, Mr. DiMartini?
No, there is nothing else on the agenda for this afternoon's meeting.
Okay, great. And with that, we will adjourn this November 17th meeting of the Finance Committee. Thank you.
Thank you.